Can you hear me? Cool. Hi everyone, welcome. And thanks very much to Vespri for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to be talking about the tech we've built at Atomico and the tools we've used to build it. And to do so, I will need this clicker over here. Cool, so before we start, any of the tools I'll mention today, none of them are in our portfolio. So you can trust what I say. With that out of the way, I'm Harry. I'm one of the software engineers on Atomico's intelligence team, and that's a multidisciplinary team comprising traditional data analyst type roles with software engineering and data science. We're separate from all other teams at Atomico and here to serve them all. So to better illustrate what we do, I've copied in some extracts from our vision statement. We're here to build a unique data asset core to firm-wide operations. We're aiming to be an objective, data-driven core, providing differentiated insights for better decision-making. We're also here to drive that data-driven mindset and push that culture across the firm. And increasingly, we want to support automation of processes so that people can spend their time as effectively as possible. Now, being a tech team in VC, however, comes with some unique complications that I'm sure will resonate with many people here. So firstly, we have to build anything we do on a constrained management fee budget. For some context, Atomico has around 65 people in its total headcount, 8 in the intelligence team, of which only 3 are software engineers and 1 data scientist. So unlike big tech or a fast-growing startup, we can't just throw 3 more engineers at a problem every time we have a new idea. We also have to transform this well-established industry and support all functions of the investment lifecycle, which is a very wide surface. So that means there's a lot to do. We have to be very strict on focusing on ROI, and that can make it quite difficult to balance iteration, adding to what we already have, and innovation, embracing new technologies and new approaches. So hopefully through this talk, you'll see that decisions we make at the tech stack level are key for supporting this vision in consideration of these complications. Getting into what we build then, before I go into how we build it, I said we're here to build a data asset, and I meant it. So first and foremost, we treat data as a product. All other applications, whether that be Entity 360, a rich UI showing everything we know about companies and people, or the signals inbox sourcing top companies for investors, all of these should use that unified data asset. And when you work this way with that data-first approach, it's great for lowering the marginal cost of adding new use cases because it can benefit from what you've already built. Zooming into that data asset, let's have a look at what's in our data model. So this is where we bring together single source of truth views across our 2 core entities, that's companies and people, as well as lots of data that relates to them. So that's funding rounds, as well as richer portfolio financial data from Vespri, which our finance team uses extensively. Also time series data, such as headcount and web traffic, and positions, showing who works at a company and where they've worked previously, as well as much more. Going into how we've built this then, let's look under the hood at our tech stack diagram, showing how we extract and load data from our sources, store and transform that data, making it available to all of our output use cases. So we're going to start on the bottom left down here, where we run a number of Python flows on Prefect to pull in data from all of our providers, which includes deliveries from your third-party data providers, as well as data pulled from the APIs of the SaaS platforms we use. So that's Affinity, our CRM, and of course Vespri. We pull all of those into our cloud data warehouse in a raw format, and from here we run a large dbt pipeline that stages that data, running entity resolution to resolve companies and people across different sources. And with this entity mapping, we can then build our unified data model for a single source of truth view on everything you saw on that last slide. Downstream of this, we can then use these concepts to build further application data. Now for read-only applications, there's quite a lot that we can do at this warehouse layer, particularly if you don't need super fast load times. So we have Looker, which I'll say more about later, but that's where we can visualize lots of this data. Or for the fund finance team, they can run analyses by pulling data into our connected Google Sheets. However, for some applications, load times are going to be really important, or you'll want to let users manipulate data with your own bespoke workflows. And for things like these, BigQuery isn't the right choice. So we need to transfer data from our warehouse into an application database where it can be queried from a Python backend that's called from a bespoke React front end with some of those applications I mentioned earlier. Getting into more advanced use cases then, we also have some proprietary ML models that are trained on the data in our warehouse. We run inference, pushing the data back in so that it can be used in our model and anywhere that uses it. To support new LLM-based applications, we also generate and store vector embeddings of our unstructured data. Now, we call this the LLM stack, but it's a bit of a hybrid of multiple things. So in fact, we do generate and store vectors on some of our unstructured data, but increasingly now a lot of this is just done by Glean, which is an enterprise search tool we've recently onboarded with that allows people to ask our data anything. What's good about Glean, though, is it's got a great API that means we can use that data in our own summaries after we've indexed it, and we can even index our own custom entities that I mentioned on the last slide. So we push our own data in, then use that in our own summaries and in content generation. Still a bit coming soon, but we plan to release features supporting automated outreach, automated pass email generation later this quarter. So with that diagram in mind, I'd now like to dive deeper into 3 key areas. The first of which is the last uber technical part of this talk, so stay with me, is DBT. So what is DBT? This stands for Data Build Tool. And while this is technical, I hope you'll see that this is really core to how we can build fast. So it's a technology that orchestrates a chain of SQL queries against your data warehouse. So people with some engineering experience will know that you'll have the traditional way of doing this might have been to have Python transformation flows that read data in from lots of different tables, transform it with a combination of SQL queries and bespoke Python logic, and push it back up to output tables. Now, those kinds of flows can easily get quite complex and really big and do too much, and it's hard to orchestrate a network of them so that downstream data is built in a timely fashion. But with DBT, you get just that. You get this network, this graph of all of your data transformations, and for each node in that graph, all you need to do is write a SQL query that selects the data from the input tables in the output format you need it in. It's a bit of a mindset shift, certainly as an engineer, but is a really powerful one. And to illustrate that, I'll just say that we started implementing with DBT in January last year. And for all of 2023, there were only 2 software engineers working on it, and DBT is far from the only place that we build. In the time to now, we've built that project out to where there are 361 models on 100 different source tables with over 600 tests. And just to be very clear, these are not uber modular, where each model only does the tiniest piece. In fact, quite the opposite, where I think plenty of them probably should be broken up into more cleaner, smaller models. So all that is to say that there's a huge amount of application logic in our DBT graph that includes modeling complex financial data we get from Vespri. And in my opinion, we would not have been able to build nearly as much in the time anywhere else. It's not without its challenges, though. So if you run all of that whole graph at once, that means that if one thing breaks somewhere, then nothing downstream is going to run until you fix it. And similarly, if one data source is slow to build, then everything downstream has to wait for it. Naturally, also, if you're going to run everything, then that means some of that computation is going to be redundant, and that can push your cloud costs up as the network starts to grow. None of these issues are insurmountable, but you'll likely spend a little bit of development effort working out which parts to run when. Moving on then, I'd love to introduce you to how we use AI at Atomico. So I mentioned earlier we have some proprietary ML models, and for time I'm going to just skim over them, but I will state what they are and you can ask more in questions later if you're interested. So the first of which predicts how likely a company is to raise funds soon so that we can prioritize accordingly. And the next 2 are more focused on predicting success. So that's through the likelihood a company significantly increases its valuation, or by quantifying inflows of talent to a startup team. 2 more models are concerned with thematic tagging to categorize companies. The first of which reads company descriptions to identify non-tech companies, which we can then filter out of most applications. And another applies sector and theme tags to those tech companies from our internal taxonomy. Interestingly, with these models, so initially we built them, they were our own custom ML models, but off-the-shelf LLMs are in fact catching up. And that's not just in terms of aptitude, but also cost and inference speed, which is really important when running this across millions of different companies. So actually, we are now in the process of switching that first one out for an off-the-shelf LLM via its API. They're not quite at the level where we can replace the second just yet, but we're going to continue monitoring this. And finally, for this slide, I'd love to introduce you to our trusted briefing generator, which we've lovingly nicknamed Dora. So with Dora, a user can go to a company page, click a button, and within about 2 minutes, they'll have an email in their inbox with a summary of all the data we have on a company. Apart from just summarizing, where this is really different from Entity 360 is that here we can surface unstructured data. We can have context from your notes in our CRM or any document in our Google Drive. And we do this with a deep content generation pipeline that combines RAG elements to retrieve that unstructured context through Glean's API and combines it with structured data in a multi-prompt approach. Now, what I find really interesting about the way we built Dora is that we released the initial version after only a 2-day hackathon in the middle of 2023. Now, at that time, as I've said, dbt was relatively new to our stack, and so was BigQuery even. So there was a lot to do, and it was hard to see when we'd get time to build experimental features with these newly available and quite exciting LLMs. But the hackathon approach allowed us to do that. So we took 2 days out of our usual workflow to experiment, but also to engage with other teams, asking them what would be most useful from new summarizing capability. And on the back of that success, we've continued using this format, finding it really useful to have that experimental slot in our calendar roughly once a quarter. And in it, we're primarily focused just on learning what we could reliably build around a new capability. But in fact, we've always had something that we've been able to release into beta after the hackathon that's been worth iterating on further in future quarters. So I definitely recommend that kind of approach in your toolkit. Next then, let's come on to Looker. So our BI tool, a dashboarding tool that can read data directly from BigQuery. So how we use Looker, we have a number of curated dashboards that we in the intelligence team support, but it's also where we can give users self-serve data access. So they can build their own dashboards, or they can search for data directly, or set up scheduled email delivery or alerts. And that makes it really key to scaling our impact, because now we don't have to even be involved in everything, right? Let alone have to write front-end code for every single little feature that we want to deliver. So that's great, but we also have full context data view. So what do I mean by that? This is where we can connect data from one source and show it next to absolutely everything else we know on that company. So for example, in our portfolio, we can pull data from Vespri and show it next to all of the other data that we might have on our portfolio companies from other sources. So you get that full context view. Similarly, for our CRM, so where previously investors might have worked entirely in the CRM, now they can use that for data entry and then come over to our enhanced pipeline view where they can view it in a more complete picture with richer fields to sort and filter it by. Additionally, we also surface a lot of ops data in charts on KPI dashboards, and the teams now use these regularly in their weekly, monthly, quarterly meetings. And that's actually really good for driving engagement, because now people are motivated to engage with that pipeline, keep their data up to date, so that their work is reflected in these charts, in these meetings. All of that means Looker is a key driver of delivering data to multiple functions of the firm, and we average around 40 users a month, which is pretty good, so nearly 2/3 of our headcount and a higher proportion of the people I'd say would expect to be using it at this point. But in the long run, there's virtually no role at Atomico that couldn't be supported in some way by Looker, so we're going to keep driving this higher. Again, though, not without its challenges, so it's quite easy to lose track of which charts use what. As you can see here, we've got a lot of content in Looker, and that makes it easy to break things when we change data in dbt. It requires some of its own Looker-specific code, so from an engineering point of view, that means there's another skill to switch to when you're building features end-to-end. And finally, allowing users to build things is, of course, a bit of a double-edged sword. So they can sometimes get it wrong. But all that means is just it's important to maintain touch points, support the build out of key dashboards, and audit things from time to time on top of course, any normal education and training you do when introducing Looker. Zooming back out to conclude then, hopefully through the course of this talk, you've seen how decisions that we make at the tech stack level are aligned to supporting our vision while being mindful of the unique complications that we face as a tech team in VC. So DBT helps us build at pace, even with our low tech headcount, by building a unified data asset that lowers the marginal cost of adding new use cases. In-house ML models are key to providing differentiated insights, while Looker helps cement a data-driven mindset across the entire firm. Finally, new LLM capabilities are supporting increased automation of processes, and we wouldn't have these capabilities if we didn't find the time to experiment, even with many competing priorities on a long roadmap. Thank you. I'd like to take any questions.
One moment, please. Okay. Thank you very much, Harry. So we do have some questions. There's a question that came in a little bit earlier. It was more, I think, geared towards the panel discussion that we had. So we'll skip that one. Unless you feel like reading it and answering it.
I like the second question better, if that's all right.
Okay, fair enough. This is a lot of build. Did you look at SaaS solutions that cover some of this and reject them? If so, why?
Yeah, so it's a really very good question. And the answer is yes, we do. So we do consider a buy and build approach. But I think we're very strict on what we want from things that we buy. So as you can see, we invest in this core of data that we expect to have an outsized impact as we continue developing it in the long run. So while we do love to buy things that make our lives easier, we don't really want to buy stuff that is going to lock us in somewhere with capabilities that we can't continue to build on over time. So from a taking load off our plate point of view, I'd love if we bought a couple more things perhaps, but actually I think aligned to what we're trying to do, then it makes a lot of sense sometimes to be investing in things that we can iterate on and build ourselves. One thing I illustrated in that talk that we have bought recently is Glean, and that lines up perfectly, right? It adds a capability, it saves us time on the development side of things, so we don't have to worry about indexing all of these documents from our Google Drive. That can be handled by Glean, and we can leverage their capabilities even in our own applications. And similarly with a CRM, right? Like it doesn't really make sense for us to go and build tools to ingest all of our emails or all of our calendar events and map those to people, when a CRM can do that and also give us that data over an API that we can then use as a very fundamental piece of our stack for more purpose.
You're a very popular guy right now, Harry, with questions. We have time for one more question before our next break. Being part of a team which have built this for several years, do you feel a lot of work being redundant with the current stack being developed?
Yeah, again, that's a really good question. Not yet. So I think there's some sourcing tools that, if you look 3 years ago, it would have made a lot of sense to start by building a sourcing piece when you're trying to prove why data-driven VC should add value. There's been a lot more that have been built in the last few years, so there's many available now. And I do think, actually, with that in mind, it might be better to use some of those automated tools for that top of funnel, getting things into your pipeline for sourcing now. Although do be careful, we've seen issues where people use the same tool and everyone sees the same top company, and a founder gets an email from about 200, or a LinkedIn message from about 200 different VCs. They don't tend to like that as much as you might think. So it's important to have differentiated data, another reason why we look to often build instead of buy. In terms of, not yet, but I do think we'll see tools that actually piece together a lot of the pieces that we've had to build. So, the platforms that we buy and have had to piece together ourselves. I think you'll start to see platforms that actually can integrate all of those in a way that is going to work for most VC firms. I do think where we see ourselves at Atomico, though, is always going to be wanting to push and have access to that data at the raw level so that we can be really building and investing in these ML models. So I think for our team, no, it's not going to feel redundant, but for others, you may want to be embracing the coming wave of tools, depending on your budget, your vision, where you want to go with data-driven VC.
Perfect. We are out of time. We have about 9 minutes.